Lydick Bog Nature Preserve is a very special place that is owned and managed by Shirley Heinze Land Trust. As a nonprofit organization, our mission is to preserve and restore natural lands and waters in northwest Indiana, and to engage people like you in nature and conservation. You can learn more about our land conservation work and our other nature preserves on our website at www.heinzetrust.org and by following us on social media with the handle Heinze Trust. Lydick Bog is a 178-acre state-dedicated nature preserve. Its natural features include rolling fields, forest, open water, a variety of wetlands, including, of course, a rare and fascinating type of wetland known as a bog. This presentation will explain what a bog is, how it was formed, and describe the unique and exotic natural community that is found here. Bogs, like Lydick, are formed by a series of specific geological events and conditions, resulting in a very unusual ecosystem. Unlike most of the surrounding countryside, bogs tend to have less plant and animal diversity, but more unique and exotic species. Bogs are fragile ecosystems and are not common in this area of Indiana. The story of Lydick Bog begins with the last ice age, which is coming to its end after more than 2.5 million years. During this time, waves of glaciers extended and retreated 4 different times over the northern parts of America, Europe, and Asia. The last Ice Age glacier reached its maximum size about 22,000 years ago. It clearly covered the Great Lakes region and has been melting since that time. All that remains of it now are the ice caps over the North Pole. Imagine looking up and seeing 1 to 2 miles of ice. Here, Toronto, Canada, is placed in relationship to the glacier's height. Closer to home, this would be at least 7 Willis Towers stacked on one another. The mass and weight are almost more than one can imagine. So much of the Earth's water was held in the glacier that the ocean level dropped by 300 to 400 feet. This resulted in the formation of the Alaskan Bering Straits land bridge connecting Asia and North America. As a point of interest, during this time, Alaska remained mostly free of ice. This enabled the first humans to migrate from Asia to the Americas about 20,000 years ago. Initially, the glacier grew from the north and moved southward. As it slid south, it scraped the surface of Canada and Wisconsin, depositing this glacial till, dirt, sand, and other surface debris in northern Indiana. The ground we walk on used to belong to our northern neighbors. The sheer weight of the glacier contributed to the formation of the Great Lakes. Many glacial boulders scattered throughout Lydick Bog Nature Preserve are evidence of this movement. By 12,000 years ago, the climate had warmed and the glacier melted. It did not melt evenly, however, leaving behind large chunks of ice called dead ice. These chunks became covered with the sediment washed away by the melting ice. As these chunks of dead ice melted, they left behind voids filled with water called Kettle lakes. The place and conditions are now set for the development of a bog, though the process is far from completion. Incidentally, most lakes around the world are formed by this process. While this illustration does not depict Lydick Bog specifically, it does show a landscape dotted with Kettle lakes. The lake in the immediate foreground exhibits some of the most common features of a Kettle lake. Typically, the shape of the lake is determined by the shape of the ice, sometimes round and other times irregular in shape. Most Kettle lakes, like the one where Lydick Bog formed, are a mile or less in diameter and measure about 30 feet in depth. As seen in this illustration, many Kettle lakes are surrounded by an encircling ridge of land. Typically, Kettle lakes are not connected to rivers or streams. Most of the water comes from precipitation. The lake occupies most of the watershed, especially those with a steep ridge around them. As a result of these conditions, the stage is set for creating the kind of environment that will develop into a bog. Because of the small watershed, Kettle lakes have few nutrients draining in from the surrounding land. Most of the nutrients come from precipitation. Further, as a result of the lack of groundwater and very little wave action, Kettle lakes stay cold and have low oxygen levels. These conditions are not favorable for plant and animal growth. The top view and cross-section drawings at the top of this illustration show what Lydick Bog would have looked like in the beginning of its development. It is a kettle lake. Initially, plant life develops around the edge of the lake, as seen in the second row of figures. What little nutrient runoff from the land surrounding the lake feeds this growth. The typical kinds of plants that grow here are cattails, rushes, sedges, and grasses. Because of the low nutrient levels, low oxygen, and cold water, decomposition of dead plant and animal life takes place very slowly. This results in a mat of living and non-living material along the edge of the lake. Biologists sometimes call this stage of development a fen ecosystem. The Kettle Lake may remain this way for a long time or even indefinitely, depending on many different environmental conditions. The next step in bog development is a major leap and requires further discussion. We will return to this illustration in a few moments. This big event is the introduction of sphagnum moss. Microscopic moss spores are released by established colonies and are able to travel long distance by the wind. Sphagnum moss is what is known as a keystone species. It is responsible for transforming the Kettle Lake into a bog. There are about 300 species of sphagnum moss worldwide. These cover more of the world's surface than any other single plant genus. It is also one of the oldest of all land plant species on Earth. Sphagnum moss does not look like most plants we know. It has no roots, no stems, no real leaves, no flowers, and no seeds. It grows in nutrient-poor environments like kettle lakes because it can thrive on only the nutrients that are falling with the precipitation. It reproduces by microscopic spores which are carried by the wind and by branching. The top end of the moss keeps growing upward while the lower part dies, but remains attached. The lower dead portion actually helps move water up to the growing tip. The accumulation of dead moss and other organic matter is called peat. If you took a handful of moss and squeezed it like a wet sponge, water would drip out. Moss can hold up to more than 20 times its weight in water. This makes moss very resistant to drought. In summary, sphagnum moss is an ideal plant for growing in a wet, cool, and low-nutrient environment. Sphagnum moss is very successful in a developing bog environment because of its ability to modify its own environment. Its growth favors itself and inhibits other plants and microscopic organisms. For instance, because it can thrive on just the nutrients it gets from precipitation, whereas other plants require much more than that to grow, it can form a thick, wet blanket that smothers out other plants. Sphagnum moss's most effective survival tactic is to create an acidic environment. Most plants, bacteria, and fungi do not survive well in such conditions. And if that were not enough, it produces a substance that inhibits bacterial and fungal growth. In years before antibiotics, people took advantage of this by applying compresses of moss to wounds, reducing infection. The nature of sphagnum moss results not only in an unusual landscape, but a fundamentally different ecosystem than most. The basic biology you see working in woodlands, wetlands, prairies, and savannas does not apply when there is sphagnum moss. Consider this photograph of our J. Timothy Ritchie Nature Preserve in Chesterton, with its trillium-covered forest floor. By the way, you may want to visit this preserve in the spring. It is beautiful. In most ecosystems like this, living organisms die and fall to the ground. Bacteria and fungi break them down into nutrients, which are recycled back into living plants. This cycle of life, death, decay, and rebirth repeats year after year after year. but this does not happen with sphagnum moss. First of all, bacteria and fungi do not thrive well in an environment that is cool, has low oxygen levels, and low nutrient levels. In addition, the acidity and antibacterial agents produced by the sphagnum moss make the same decomposition as takes place in other ecosystems impossible here. As sphagnum moss grows, its mat thickens and extends towards the center of the lake. In 1875, as a matter of interest, there was open water in Lydick Bog, known as Wolverton Lake at that time. Since then, the bog mat has closed over the entire surface of the pond. Currently, this mat is floating over the Kettle Lake. In fact, if you were to walk on the bog, it would move up and down slightly. This is called a quaking bog. Eventually, the sediment from the mat settles at the bottom of the lake, and over time, fills it in completely. Forestation is the final stage of bog succession. Lydick Bog is a long way from this stage. Also, due to shade from surrounding vegetation and groundwater nutrients entering the edges of the lake, a watery moat often surrounds the developing bog. In the case of Lydick Bog, this moat supports tall willows and poison sumac, so you must be careful of what you touch. While the thickness of the bog mat may vary from one area to another, it generally consists of two layers: a thin, living surface layer of vegetation and a deeper, permanently waterlogged peat layer. The upper layer favors acid-tolerant plants and those that do not require many nutrients to grow. As a result, bogs may support numerous unusual plants, but they are limited in their biodiversity. Because of the sphagnum moss, a bog is not an easy place for common plants of our area to grow, as there are not enough nutrients and it is too acidic. Some plants have developed unusual and clever ways of finding the nutrients that are necessary for them to grow. The rather peculiar carnivorous plants are well-known examples of these. For the most part, they capture and digest insects in order to acquire the necessary nutrients that are so hard to come by in a bog. The most conspicuous of these plants, and perhaps the best known, is the northern or purple pitcher plant. Its modified leaves create a tube, generally 6 to 8 inches tall, with a small pool of water in its basin. Insects find their way into the trap and are unable to escape due to the waxy inner surface and stiff, downward-pointing, tiny hairs lining the interior of the tube. The modified leaves produce digestive enzymes that chemically break down the unfortunate victims. There is a whole microcommunity of bacteria, tiny organisms, and insect larvae that live in the pitcher plant and even contribute to the digestion of the plant's prey. These tubes last for a year or two and then are replaced with new growth. The flower of the pitcher plant stands on a tall stem, hangs upside down, and is pollinated by bees. Pitcher plants are unlikely to ever become a popular houseplant, as the fragrance of their flowers is reminiscent of cat urine. The smaller common sundew is another carnivorous plant found at Lydick Bog. It also captures insects, but using an entirely different mechanism than the pitcher plant. The sundew uses modified leaves with tentacles, ending with a sticky, sugary secretion to attract and capture insects. As the insect becomes caught in the sticky secretion, its movement triggers the leaf to curl around the prey so it cannot escape. The leaf surface releases digestive enzymes, and in time the nutrients are absorbed. The modified leaves are only used one time and then must be replaced. A variety of other, more common plants to our area live either on the bog or near its fringe. Each of these plant types has to survive in an acidic, low-nutrient environment. The more common plants include leatherleaf, poison sumac, willows, blueberry, grasses, and sedges. As you move off the bog and onto the land, the diversity of plants increases dramatically. Lydick Bog is in its early stage of forestation. The first trees to begin growing in a bog are called pioneering species. They are the ones that are the most able to tolerate the limiting bog conditions. Tamarack trees are often the first of these trees and are commonly found at Lydick Bog. The word tamarack comes from the North American native Algonquin language meaning wood used for snowshoes. Tamarack trees grow very slowly, so they are actually much older than their height and size would suggest. They generally grow away from other trees as they are intolerant of shade. Tamarack trees are, in fact, the reason why Lydick Bog was discovered by local ecologists. Looking for records of a type of plant that typically grows near tamarack trees resulted in biologists looking at aerial images of the area and identifying these trees as tamarack trees. Further investigation resulted in the discovery of this bog. Tamarack trees are easy to identify because they have short green needles which all turn yellow and fall in the autumn. Other pioneering species that move in after tamarack trees are black spruce, jack pine, white pine, and red maple. Bogs not only add to the diversity of ecosystems, but also make some other important contributions. Bogs help control flooding during heavy rains by holding water. Bogs store carbon. About 1/3 of all the soil carbon in the world is held in peat bogs. This is increasingly important in these days of climate change. Because plants and animals do not decay due to the lack of decomposition in a bog, they hold important historical information. Centuries of past animal and plant life can be traced by examining the peat layers of a bog. Countries like Denmark are famous for their bog people. While there have been 6,000 or more year-old remains found in North American bogs, none so far have been found at Lydick Bog. Bogs are fragile ecosystems. They operate within very narrow conditions and are particularly impacted by water table changes and runoff contamination. They can be harmed or even destroyed by flooding, drought, forest fires, and water level changes from beaver dams. Recreational vehicles can also negatively impact bogs. For centuries, people have mined peat for fuel. In Scandinavia, there are still municipal power plants that burn peat. We also use peat for gardening. The largest threat by far is agriculture. Agriculture can change the water table to make the land more suitable for a variety of different crops. They may also be used as places for crops such as cranberries, which do thrive in bog-like habitats, and in fact there are native cranberries that grow at Lydick Bog. Shirley Heinze has a different vision for Lydick Bog. We envision a place of natural wonder and respite, accessible year-round through educational trails, and enhanced with gathering and comfort amenities. Our long-term plans are to make Lydick Bog Nature Preserve one of our stewardship staging areas for our operations in St. Joseph, Stark, and Marshall counties. We want to provide learning experiences that will help people understand the unique bog habitat and allow them to appreciate the joy and wonder of the natural features found here in northwestern Indiana. We are working hard on our goal of giving the public a more immersive experience with this bog habitat through the development of a boardwalk that will enter the bog itself. There is no better way to experience a bog ecosystem than to walk through it. The sights, sounds, and scents all leave a lasting impression, especially when enhanced by an understanding of the ecosystem. Learning to appreciate Lydick Bog will help people appreciate other natural areas as well. Lydick Bog Nature Preserve is not just a valuable community resource for St. Joseph County, but will be a regional attraction as well. Please support our vision.